Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Closed Partisan Mind, A New Psychology of American Polarization by Matthew D. Luttig. Narrated by Chris Monteiro. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures, tables, and appendices present in the print and e-book formats of the book. The thing about democracy, beloveds, is that it is not neat, orderly, or quiet. It requires a certain relish for confusion. Molly Ivins. Introduction. The rigidity of the right and the rigidity of the extremes. In November 2016, immediately following the election of President Donald Trump, Saturday Night Live ran a comedy sketch in the form of an advertisement in which the unthinkable didn't happen. A liberal paradise called The Bubble was proposed. The Bubble was a place where the internet was restricted to show only the good sites: HuffPo, Daily Kos, YouTube videos about sushi rice, and the explosive comedy of McSweeney's. The Bubble promised to be a utopia for open-minded freethinkers to close themselves in and avoid the then imminent America of President Trump. The implication of this sketch, of course, is that strong Democrats with the most negative reaction toward Trump were, despite espousing openness, actually rather closed-minded. Republicans, meanwhile, seemed to like their bubbles just as much as SNL's hypothetical Democrats. For instance, many Republicans express a host of factually erroneous beliefs: that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, that Trump's presidential inauguration drew more attendees than any other inauguration in U.S. history, and that global warming is a hoax. These and other attitudes suggest that Republicans, like the aforementioned parodied Democrats, are closed and feel secure only when ensconced inside their own bubble. These parodies, anecdotes, and data points about public opinion in the modern United States suggest that Democrats and Republicans alike may be more closed than open. Many people, in fact, would agree with this description. For instance, a 2016 report published by the Pew Research Center indicated that majorities of both Democrats and Republicans thought that members of the other party were more closed-minded than their fellow co-partisans. Are these characterizations fair? What precisely is the relationship between closed minds and partisan identity? Is it accurate to say that modern partisans are, in some sense, psychologically closed? This book investigates these questions. Specifically, I examine whether people who are psychologically closed are more intensely partisan than people who are psychologically open. By partisan, I mean something specific: the extent to which people feel an identification with, an emotional connection to, and a sense of personal relevance for supporting the Democratic and Republican parties. I focus on the construct of partisanship for two reasons. First, partisanship is one of the primary ways in which Americans today are politically divided. There may also be some amount of ideological polarization in society, depending on which political scientist you ask. But while the debate over the ideological climate continues, the partisan environment is fairly settled. According to Mason, political scientists can disagree until we are blue in the face over the extent of America's policy polarization, but are citizens prejudiced in their evaluations of political opponents? Absolutely. The second reason I focus on partisanship in particular is that many political scientists, though not all, conceive of partisanship as a social identity rather than a reflection of ideological orientations or policy preferences. This conception has profound implications for our expectations about the association between closed minds and the intensity of an individual's partisanship. Indeed, since I derived my hypotheses about the link between closed minds and intense partisan identities from psychological literature closely associated with the social identity paradigm, this book can be viewed as a type of test of the social identity conception of partisanship. I label the type of partisanship that I investigate in the upcoming sections group-centric partisanship. As I define it, this is a way of expressing one's social identification with the political parties, and it reflects the multiple components of social identity theory as defined by Henri Tajfel as the individual's knowledge that he belongs to certain social groups, together with some emotional and value significance to him of this group membership. This definition incorporates both cognitive self-categorization, knowledge of belonging, and emotional and value significance, feelings and judgments. The term therefore builds on past understandings of partisanship within the expressive or social identity perspective as a psychological attachment and an enduring identity signifying emotional connection. The concept of group-centric partisanship also incorporates a number of the concepts and measures that political scientists have developed to capture differences in the intensity of partisanship, including partisan strength and effective partisan polarization. Yet none of the concepts or measures of variation across people in the intensity of their partisanship currently in use in the field of political science, including partisan strength or effective polarization, achieves the goal of capturing the multifaceted definition of social identity. Both the traditional and newer revised measures of partisan identity strength primarily reflect cognitive self-categorization, but neglect feelings and values as well as views of the outgroup. Similarly, Iyengar, Sood, and Locus's theory of effective polarization seeks to utilize a definitional test of social identity theory by deploying a measure of the difference in the feelings people have toward their own party relative to the opposition. This incorporates the emotional dimension of social identity and the crucial importance of outgroup as well as in-group sentiment, but it does not measure the cognitive or value components of the theory. I believe that a more complete understanding of the social identity theory of partisanship can be achieved by incorporating all of these attributes of partisanship into a single conception. From this perspective, the concepts of partisan strength and effective polarization should be thought of as expressions of being a group-centric partisan. This book, therefore, will examine the relationship between psychological closure and group-centric partisanship, by which I mean strong partisan identification, effectively polarized feelings about the parties, and the extent to which one incorporates the party's perceived values into their own worldview. In conducting this inquiry, I build on and engage with a great deal of scholarship from political psychologists, many of whom have previously examined whether and how psychological closure and related variables may be associated with political preferences. For example, rigidity, dogmatism, and fear of threat and uncertainty were traits that earlier researchers associated with Nazism and fascism, and more recently with right-wing authoritarianism. Others, however, have argued that a rigid or closed cognitive style is associated with extremism on both the left and the right. These two hypotheses, the rigidity of the right versus the rigidity of the extremes, constitute the primary claims that both earlier and modern researchers have investigated with respect to the relationship between psychological closure and political preferences. Today, the rigidity of the right hypothesis has many more supporters than the alternative, particularly among scholars who study U.S. politics. Ariel Malka and colleagues reflect this when they write that people who are intolerant of uncertainty and sensitive to threat tend to have a cognitive motivational affinity for right-wing ideology. It is fair to say that this viewpoint has become conventional wisdom. One of my aims in this book is to push back, slightly, and release some tension from this reigning view of the relationship between psychological closure and political preferences that exists among many political psychologists. To do so, I argue that psychological closure is a construct that leads toward group-centric partisanship among both Republicans and Democrats. Nevertheless, it is fair to assert that people who are closed tend to identify more with Republicans, while people who are open tend to be found more among Democrats. While this claim may not hold up in all eras or all contexts, it does seem to be valid in the contemporary United States. My own data even bear this out. For instance, in a survey I commissioned in 2014 through the organization YouGov, I found that 58% of Republicans, compared to 46% of Democrats, scored in the top half of a measure known as the Need for Cognitive Closure, NFCC, a well-validated measure of psychological closure that I will elaborate on shortly. 1 point, therefore, for the rigidity of the right hypothesis. The conventional view, however, often ends at this finding, that closure is more common among those on the right than it is among those on the left. But this finding does not eliminate the possibility that psychological closure may lead people, regardless of whether they are Democrat or Republican, to exhibit characteristics of group-centric partisanship, identifying strongly with their party, displaying negative feelings toward the political outgroup, and conforming to views of party leaders. The conventional view, in other words, risks oversimplifying the relationship between closed minds and political preferences. A more accurate summary of the relationship between closed minds and political attitudes needs to incorporate an alternative perspective labeled the rigidity of the extremes. Indeed, there are strong theoretical reasons to think that this rigidity of the extremes hypothesis may also have some validity. As I will explain in detail in Chapter 1, there is a correspondence between psychological theories of cognitive closure and social identity theories of bipartisanship that leads to the alternative expectation that closed minds may be attracted to extreme political preferences on both the left and the right. Crucially, however, the extremes that these theories suggest will be appealing to the psychologically closed are not ideological in nature. Rather, psychological research on cognitive closure suggests that it is an attribute that predisposes an individual to be group-centric, motivated to identify strongly with their own group, incorporate the group's values into their own, and distance themselves from their opponents. Hence, I suggest that political psychologists revise their understanding of the rigidity of the extremes hypothesis away from ideological values and toward a group-centric understanding, with partisanship reconceived as a social identity rather than an expression of ideology. Based on these theoretical premises, I hypothesized that psychological closure could lead both Democrats and Republicans toward a more group-centric expression of partisanship. Therefore, the closing of the partisan mind, I suggest, may be a bipartisan process. The open and closed mind. The distinction between open and closed is at the heart of this book. Throughout, the conception and measure of closure or closed-mindedness that I employ are based on the philosophy and psychology of the need for cognitive closure, NFCC. NFCC is a widely used variable in the psychological literature that, crucially, provides a very clear theory about and measure of the concept of closed-mindedness. Ari Kruglanski, who pioneered the study of the need for cognitive closure, describes those with a strong need for cognitive closure as desiring to seize and freeze on beliefs and information. People with a strong need for cognitive closure are more likely to seize on readily available information to reach a quick conclusion, as that is more closure-providing than maintaining an open mind, and to freeze on that conclusion, to maintain their closure once a judgment has been formed. Federico and Deason provide another helpful definition of the concept. In general, individuals with a high need for closure tend to find uncertainty highly unsettling, and they try to eliminate it as quickly and definitely as possible. Most of us can recall times when a period of uncertainty or strife temporarily made us anxious and eager to resolve a particular challenge or situation. Individuals with a high level of need for cognitive closure experience this discomfort on a chronic basis. Hence, the closed-minded thinking that individuals with a strong need for cognitive closure engage in is driven not by malice, but by a deeper psychological need to avoid and/or eliminate psychic stress. Such individuals are motivated to avoid the painful experience of uncertainty or confusion, and as a result, they exhibit a cognitive style that leads them to quickly form judgments and to hold on dogmatically to those judgments once formed. Quickly forming judgments and holding those judgments dogmatically are characteristic of the closed mind, and the value of the NFCC construct is that it seeks to capture those two aspects of information processing directly. The measures of NFCC that I rely on most in this book are scales based on a series of questions, 15 in the case of the YouGov study mentioned earlier. Appendix A presents the full set of questions that make up these NFCC scales. The questions ask respondents to agree or disagree with a variety of statements, including 1. I don't like situations that are uncertain. 2. I feel irritated when one person disagrees with what everyone else in a group believes. 3. When I am confronted with a problem, I'm dying to reach a solution very quickly. 4. I find that establishing a consistent routine enables me to enjoy life more. And 5. I prefer things that I am used to over things I am unfamiliar with. One benefit of these questions is their face validity in assessing the extent to which someone is open or closed-minded. The closed prefer situations that are certain, feel irritated by a lack of conformity within a group, feel real relief when they can reach a solution quickly, prefer living within a highly consistent routine, and favor the familiar over the unfamiliar. The open, by contrast, exhibit the opposite tendencies. They revel in ambiguity, enjoy discussions within groups of dissimilar people, are capable of withholding judgment on a difficult problem, prefer having diverse days where the unexpected can happen, and enjoy exposing themselves to new people, things, and ideas rather than what they already know and feel comfortable with. Another benefit of these questions is the absence of any explicit political content. Unlike widely used measures in political psychology, such as the Big Five personality traits of openness to experience and some measures of authoritarianism, such as the right-wing authoritarianism RWA scale, the NFCC questionnaire completely avoids anything related to political disputes. This is a major but potentially overlooked benefit of the NFCC scale in comparison to other widely used measures in the field. At a minimum, it implies that associations between the need for cognitive closure and political outcome variables will not be tautological. The absence of political content should also protect against respondents giving false answers to the questions, a possibility for questions such as those on child-rearing preferences, the basis for the modern measure of authoritarianism, which may have become implicitly partisan and therefore incentivize people to provide a politically correct response. The origin of open and closed minds is multifaceted. Like many psychological variables, individual differences in the NFCC construct appear to be a product of both nature and nurture, genetics and environment. Research has established that individual differences in the NFCC scale are partly heritable. But genes alone do not determine an individual's need for cognitive closure. In fact, recent research suggests that we may have some degree of control over how open or closed we are. For example, that activities such as reading fiction, practicing mindfulness and meditation, and cognitive behavioral training can make someone more open-minded, i.e., decrease their need for cognitive closure and/or increase their openness to new experiences. Thus, while this book treats NFCC largely as a predisposition, a precursor to outcome variables such as political beliefs, this should in no way be interpreted to imply that an individual's score on NFCC is unalterable. An individual's degree of open or closed-mindedness, like most other aspects of individual psychology, can and does change. How do the open and closed differ from each other? Research suggests that people at the poles of the NFCC construct differ in a variety of ways. For example, studies show that people high in the need for cognitive closure score lower on the openness to experience dimension of the Big Five personality traits, are less creative, are more prejudiced against outgroups, consider less information when forming opinions, are less supportive of pro-environmental policies and behaviors, are more likely to be religious fundamentalists and to endorse conspiracy beliefs, are sometimes more militaristic, and are group-centric, a mindset characterized by attitudes such as favoritism toward in-groups and the denigration of out-groups. The ideological and partisan beliefs of open and closed minds. Several researchers have also investigated how people with open and closed minds differ in terms of their left versus right political views. Studies show that people with high levels of the need for cognitive closure are more conservative and more likely to identify as Republicans, whereas those who are more open-minded tend to be more common among self-identified liberals and Democrats. In a meta-analysis of over 80 studies, John Jost and colleagues concluded that political conservatism has its roots in the psychological need to protect against threat and uncertainty, and NFCC was used as one of the primary indicators of the motivation to avoid uncertainty, which predicts embracing a conservative political orientation. This paradigm about the psychological underpinnings of conservative ideology is sometimes described as the rigidity of the right hypothesis. Individuals who are politically aligned with the right are characterized by psychological traits, such as the need for cognitive closure, associated with a rigid cognitive style. The originator of the NFCC scale describes why those high in the need for cognitive closure are less common on the left side of the political spectrum. Because left-wing ideologies espouse egalitarianism, democracy, and openness to new ideas, their contents are incompatible with need for closure-based psychological strivings for stability and inequality. But despite the consensus within the field that people who are cognitively closed are more likely to identify with right-wing ideologies and political parties, recent scholarship has identified limitations and qualifications to this general claim. For example, one point of growing consensus is that psychological closure has a natural affinity with conservatism in the domain of social and cultural politics, regarding, for instance, immigration, gay marriage, and abortion, but not for economic issues, e.g., the minimum wage and the marginal tax rate. Another common finding in the field is that the association between psychological needs, like the need for cognitive closure, and political attitudes is concentrated among individuals who are highly attentive to politics. That is, they know and care about politics and spend at least some of their limited time following current events, and among those who are the most highly educated. The attentive and the educated possess two characteristics that enhance the link between their psychology and their politics. First, they are more knowledgeable about politics, and so they have greater ability to choose political attitudes that serve the purposes they desire, such as reaching cognitive closure. Second, the attentive are more likely than the indifferent to think that their political attitudes reflect who they are. Those individuals who pay attention to politics, then, have greater motivation to use politics for self-serving purposes. People who spend time following politics, therefore, have both a greater ability and more of a motivation to bring their psychological goals into alignment with their political beliefs. Another set of emerging findings is that the psychological need for closure is sometimes associated with particular policy preferences, more among self-identified liberals than conservatives. For example, Federico, Deason, and Fisher show in the domain of specific policy preferences, or what political scientists call operational ideology, that is, one's attitudes about issues being debated at a specific time and place, that NFCC has stronger effects among those who identify symbolically as liberal than among those who identify as conservative. Similarly, Baldner et al. Have shown that the effect of NFCC on the endorsement of binding moral foundations, moral values emphasizing in-group loyalty, respect for authority, and religious or spiritual sanctity, is greater for liberals than it is for conservatives. Findings like these complicate a blanket rigidity of the right narrative, and they suggest that there is value in investigating how the NFCC construct is related to political attitudes separately among individuals on the left and on the right. Thus, even though prior scholarship has shown that Republicans are more closed than Democrats, we should not make presumptions about how this correlation maps onto or can explain levels of group-centric partisanship within a party. Theoretical considerations also suggest a need to complicate a simplistic rigidity of the right hypothesis as an explanation for the intensity of partisanship. In particular, the rigidity of the right model developed in political psychology was originally based on differences between liberals and conservatives, not Democrats and Republicans. But partisanship, according to many political scientists, is not simply a reflection of a person's ideological perspective. Instead, many political scientists argue that partisan identity is a type of social identity in its own right, a product of socialization and emotional connection rather than a rational reflection of political values. Indeed, the theory of affective polarization, the growing divide between people's feelings toward their own party and their feelings toward the opposite party, itself originates in this distinction between ideology and affect. As Iyengar, Sood, and Locus put it, to the extent that party identification represents a meaningful group affiliation, the more appropriate test of polarization is affective, not ideological. It is based on this perspective that Iyengar, Sood, and Locus identified a previously overlooked amount of polarization in U.S. society. Prior to their work, most research on polarization and public opinion focused on ideology. From an ideological perspective, it was clear that people were sorting, that is, bringing their political preferences and ideology into alignment with their partisanship, but it was not clear that people were polarizing. Yet when Iyengar, Sood, and Locus shifted the frame of reference to partisan affect, that is, positive affect toward one's own group and negative affect toward the outgroup, the evidence for polarization became clear. They showed that more Americans had become opposed to inter-party marriage and had developed a wider gap in their feelings toward the two parties. They liked their own party more and the opposite party much less. One of the widely known consequences for the need for cognitive closure is that it creates a pressure for people to like their own group more than outgroups, a pattern reflected in the argument that people with a strong NFCC are group-centric. The pattern and kind of mass polarization that emerged in the United States in the latter decades of the 20th century, and that persist into the present, are therefore reminiscent of this broader psychological pattern, whereby people with a strong need for closure develop strong ties to their own group and become hostile toward outgroups. Could this psychological dynamic provide insight into the rise of affective polarization and other characteristics of group-centric partisanship, such as partisan strength, in U.S. society? To date, a few studies have investigated this possibility. Smigrod, Renfro, and Robbins, for example, have found that extreme partisans, regardless of whether they are Democrat or Republican, exhibit a cognitive style indicative of closed-mindedness and inflexibility. I, too, have reported in 2 publications a similar set of findings, that strong Democrats and Republicans, as well as Democrats and Republicans with the most effectively polarized feelings about the parties, are more authoritarian and score higher in their need for cognitive closure. Findings like these suggest that even while there are more closed-minded individuals in the Republican camp than in the Democratic one, the closed-minded, regardless of party, are also most common among strong partisans and the effectively polarized than among weakly identified partisans and those with more moderate feelings about the parties. The strongest and most divided partisans, those who, in other words, exhibit a group-centric type of partisanship on both sides of the aisle, appear to be characterized by a shared tendency for psychological closure. the closing of the partisan mind as a bipartisan phenomenon. In the chapters that follow, I expand on these findings by unpacking the theoretical link between partisanship.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?